Hey guys, welcome to my TED Talk / single person panel. Today I'm going to be talking about sex trafficking, racism, sexism, child sexual abuse, trauma, and their unjust handling in the criminal justice system. These lived experiences overlap in the story of Cyntoia Brown, a woman whose journey and plight from trauma exposes our very own prejudices, deeply ingrained and reflected in our institutions and day-to-day lives. One victim carried the brunt of violence, abuse, and of condemnation before her case was illuminated in the eyes of the media and society as the severe mishandling of justice that it was. To analyze her grueling situation effectively enough while taking into consideration the various intersections working to oppress her, I honed in on one docuseries revolving around her imprisonment at the age of 16 and the attempts of gaining her liberation. PBS's Sentencing Children, Cyntoia's Story presents us with 7 episodes, each ranging from 5 to 10 minutes, that expose the process of her indictment and conviction while following the difficult steps requiring the reopening of her case to create long-standing change in the criminal sentencing of children in the state of Tennessee. This film's treatment of the unjust criminalization of a young black victim of sexual abuse mimics the ambiguity of the ways her case was framed to the general public. The scenes included are in the series for a reason, and I plan on picking apart what we observe from the episodes while primarily also focusing on the very crucial things they leave out. I'm gonna primarily analyze the very first episode because that's where you see more of the actual interaction the interviewers had with Cyntoia Brown, as well as the actual court case itself and what she had to say about her experiences. So let's check out some of those bits and pieces.
Well, I have to think about that every day. What? Me saving life. Right. Saving life is ignoring these people, honey, so you can have a life. At the rate you're going, you won't have a life. I won't have a life anyway, so I don't have to have any. You don't understand what I did. I killed somebody. I know you did. I know you did. I know you did.
I thought he was reaching for a gun, so I'm like, oh, shit. You know what I'm saying? That's what he's done. He's gonna murder me or rape me or something.
Yeah. And then what did you do?
I shot him. And it's like all these thoughts all of a sudden rushed in my head. What have I done? What am I doing? What just happened?
Biological mother side of the family is extremely heavily loaded with psychiatric disorders.
Bipolar, personality disorder, suicidal, manic depressive, which is an guarded condition. At times I've had homicidal thoughts for people that have hurt me. I've been raped, and I've always, wanted to do things to them for hurting me.
And what were you doing with Cut in the motel room at the In-Town Suites?
We were either getting high or having sex. That's all we ever did. He said that I was slipping and that I was starting to become a slouch, that I needed to get out and get on my grind and get some money.
What's this guy Cut? What's his real name?
Gary and McLean. I remember one time, the first time he did something to me is when he choked me and I passed out. Because he said I thought he was a joke.
What else did he do to you?
He talked real bad to me and jacked me up. He pulled me by my hair and dragged me and stuff. He put guns up to me, told me to strap and stuff like that, getting that at with other people.
Did you ever have sex with the guys?
When I Cut put a gun up to me, I did.
Did he have sex with you too?
Yeah, he had sex with me. Sometimes I don't want to have sex with him. He'd still me. I'd be crying and everything.
So how come you stayed with him?
You're not listening. I made him money. He wasn't gonna let me go nowhere. He's told me he'd kill me. He knows where my mom lives. And I know the dude choked me till I almost passed out. He's not afraid to kill me.
What first pegged me as interesting about this particular series and this episode is that they did not talk about her race whatsoever. They just failed to mention it. And although Cyntoia is mixed, she passes for black, and that's a big reason as to why she was so quickly criminalized in the way that she was. There is a great disproportionality and disparity in the foster system and the child welfare system, which makes sense considering the variety of social hierarchies created and reinforced that line up against her. Those in lower socioeconomic classes with higher rates of impoverishment are disproportionately people of color. Women in impoverished areas are more susceptible, therefore, to be targets of sex trafficking, and generally speaking, intimate partner and domestic violence are more widespread problems among their homes as well. Applying this knowledge to cyntoia, we know that up until she was a toddler, she lived with her biological parents for some time and was then put up for adoption. With her adoptive parents, her case didn't really get any better. She was slapped around by her father, and as she mentioned during one of her initial interviews, it was an environment that she wanted to escape, and she did. One of the first alarming factors that we see here, and that ultimately led to her conviction and 51-year sentence, was that she was tried as an adult when she was only 16. I was surprised to see that they chose to try her in this way, because 16-year-olds aren't adults and she shouldn't have been treated as one. We see her in the clips that they show with her interviews that she is very collected and mature for her age, which I'd say is pretty common in cases where children are exposed to adult problems way too early in life. In cases particular to child sexual abuse, it's also important to note that it is impossible for children to give consent. One must have both knowledge and authority to properly consent, and those are void in these instances. The fact that she was also tried as an adult unjustly made me wonder whether it has something to do with race and whether that ties in somehow. After looking into it, I found that Black female children are seen as less innocent and less feminine than white female children. There is this concept of adultification that follows young Black girls starting at a very early age, as well as with young Black males. In the cases of the males, police violence against them is more justified. With the females, stereotypes such as them being overly loud are imbued with adult-like aspirations and are in turn perceived as a threat. A study recorded that teachers describe Black girls as sophisticated and even controlling at a young age. And we have to take into account the hypersexualization of Black girls as well, with some of this perception rooted in them maturing physically at a faster rate than white girls. Their sexualization and adultification can both be traced back to slavery, as Black people were put to work as soon as they could walk, leading to their perception as older than their actual age, and Black girls, slaves, commonly faced sexual harassment throughout their entire lives. White children, therefore, enjoy more legal protections in cases of child abuse, while Black youth's childlike behavior are responded to more punitively and with suspicion. Let's also take a look now at the abuse cyntoia described and the connections she made between her traumatic past and the alarms that went off in her head with Johnny Allen's behavior, the man that she shot.
Who approached you?
A man in a white truck.
And is this the person that has been referred to throughout this hearing, Mr. Allen?
Yes. He didn't want to go to the hotel. He said that he wanted to go to his house because there was no one there. That time he was just finished telling me about his accomplishments and saying how that he used to be in the Army and that he was a sharpshooter in the Army. And then he had told me how a lot of women want him for his money and that he wanted someone to make love with him with desire.
Okay. Did you see any guns in the house?
Yes, I seen 2 shotguns downstairs, and he showed me a chrome gun with a black handle.
Where were you when he showed you that?
I was sitting at the table eating my food.
Do you tend to be a nervous person?
Yeah.
Was there anything that made you especially nervous that night?
Just how he was acting, just how he talked. It's like the way he talked, how he was just so important and stuff. And then me, I look at myself, who am I? Who am I to him? It's like, then he talks about the guns and stuff. If he does something to me, I'm sitting here thinking, what can I do?
You ate with him, you felt comfortable doing that. You sat on the couch and watched TV with him, you felt comfortable doing that. You got in the bed and at least one time went to sleep while he was there. You felt comfortable doing that.
I never went to sleep. He just grabbed me in between my legs, he just grabbed it real hard. And he just gave me this look. It was like a very fierce look. And then it just sent these chills up my spine. I'm thinking he's gonna hit me or do something like that. But then he rolls over and reaches, like he's reaching to the side of the bed or something. So I'm thinking, now he's not finna hit me. He's finna get a gun.
And what
And-
did you do at that time?
I just grabbed the gun and I shot him.
Cyntoia serves as a prime example of child sex trafficking and the disproportionate susceptibility of girls of color to sex trafficking. Liberals recognize now, for the most part, that the rate of incarceration of men of color is very high. What is less talked about is the criminalization of girls and women that have been trafficked, particularly those of color. Their intersection of exploitation meets at the sexualization due to their gender and their criminalization because of their race. The circumstances she detailed in her interview describe how she was threatened at gunpoint by the man that sold her to other men, Cutthroat, and he even raped her on multiple occasions at gunpoint. So she was forced to do all these sexual acts out of fear that she would be killed if she didn't do otherwise. She was also choked to death by him. And we know that men that abuse their intimate partners, or just like abusers in general that choke people, are much more likely to kill their partners. So it's not wrong of her to think that and to be scared. What struck me as interesting about this is that it didn't show their defense that was rooted primarily in her claim of self-defense. If a man is taking you to his house, isolated from anywhere you're familiar with, and he specifically said he wanted to go there because it wasn't around anybody else, and he's talking about his gun collection all the while, I feel like a fear of being in grave danger would be pretty justified, and killing somebody in self-defense because of these things, especially when you think he's reaching for a gun, makes sense. The video's aim seems to pull attention only toward the fact that children are too young to understand the finality of their actions, and not on her emotions and why those emotions were there, considering her very traumatic history and relevant history. Now, in analyzing what they did include, it's important to note that a lot of it feeds into her negative portrayal and that it harmed her and led to her imprisonment in the first place. In the first 2 minutes of the episode, like almost right off the bat, they emphasize psychiatric illness on her mother's side of the family. Not many people are familiar with the term of intergenerational trauma, but it is very common that when mothers or parents are abused and have traumatic pasts and have not been processed, they very oftentimes end up in like traumatic situations later in lives that traumatize their children as well. The only time they so much as hinted at Cyntoia's trauma was when they asked if she tends to be a nervous person, to which she replied yes. And people with PTSD tend to experience hyperarousal of things around them and of various stimulations, as well as recurring intrusion of memories of the past trauma. It doesn't register in the brain that the traumatic experience is over for people with PTSD. I also think that the emphasis on her mother's mental history reduces the scope of blame for the ordeal on Cyntoia's inherent biology, rather than taking into account the effects she endured at the hands of her abusive situation that obviously held a lasting impact. And they also made sure to include the question, so how come you stayed with him, after she detailed all her circumstances that she was susceptible to under Cutthroat's control and abuse. And she said, you haven't been listening. This harmful mentality correlates directly with victim blaming, a common cultural phenomenon that translates into the legislative process of trying women that were in abusive situations and experienced intimate partner violence. Now, 13 years after her imprisonment, people started fighting for her appeal. And what they emphasized there was kind of more of her mental illness, but they only listed it off as a reason, as like reasons as to why she should get her appeal in the first place. So they mentioned her trauma, child sexual abuse, the physical abuse she endured, but they didn't go into the effects they'd had on her and why they would have caused her to act like in certain ways that they did, or that she did. The PTSD overall was undermined and was left for us to infer past its brief mention. And looking at her old interviews back from when she was 16 and initially arrested, she seemed pretty unaffected. and the camera wants you to note that. They zoom in on her face, and she's very stoic, very monotone in a way. She's, I don't know, just like explaining exactly what they want to hear, but without emotion. And that would be a side effect of trauma, which a lot of people wouldn't think. But a traumatized person can either experience intense emotion with little or no memory of the event or events, or they may be able to recount every detail with seemingly no emotion, which is what we see with cyntoia. Her trauma response, I think, definitely contributed to the court and her interviewer's assumptions that she has no remorse, that she was just there to kill the guy and rob him, which feeds into the stereotype that black people are hardened criminals, when in fact they are just more likely to have experienced a life of trauma than in your white suburban household that we see as the norm, and refuse to acknowledge how these differences play out in people's lives and mental health. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of screen time went into these interviews, with the camera zooming in very closely on her face as she held a stoic expression while describing her circumstances. This also reminded me of the double standard there is for women, especially when they are recounting their situations in court, or whenever they just want to speak up about harassment or abuse. This double standard is that we are either too emotional or not emotional enough. We're either too flustered and we lose credibility because of that, because it's like, oh, she's so emotional, she's over-exaggerating, you know how women are. Or, like, if there's not enough emotion, they're like, clearly it didn't affect her that much, so why should we care? And this definitely plays into how courts and juries would see women and see their stories and how, like, relevant or true they may be. The film's ultimate motive is to bring awareness to the necessity of reform with juvenile justice laws, and highlighting cyntoia's case as the primary example as to why reform is needed. I find that it would have been more effective had the docuseries aimed to explain more of why the justice system failed her in her specific case in the way that it had. And that brings us to ask, what should have been done in response to cyntoia's case? What bothers me just as much as anything else is that cyntoia didn't get the chance to be acknowledged or recognized as a victim. This sort of guarantee a white girl her age would benefit from was denied from her from the very beginning and resulted in very different treatment overall. This aspect of her criminalization in absence of victimization is also shown in the absence of mention of her abuser's fate. Cutthroat was specifically named by cyntoia multiple times and all his abusive, terrible actions detailed, but his own conviction was never once noted in the series. We don't even know anything of his arrest or trial, and this only helps to build the framework for establishing cyntoia as a criminal rather than the victim. Well, thank you for tuning in. I hope that you learned something and will take away a lot from this. Yeah, I'm going to polish up more at the end of this with my final draft. Bye!